is primarily ecclesiological. It shows why he has such a deep problem with the traditional Latin Mass, which he and his cohorts clearly reject. Francis said at the end of that letter, in due time, every Roman Catholic needs to quote-unquote return to the Novus Ordo.
To talk about liturgical reform and sacramental validity, Matt Gaspers from Catholic Family News is going to be on the show today to talk about this correlation. Why would we be questioning the validity of sacraments if there was no reform? Maybe we wouldn't be. We're going to have that coming up at 30 past the hour.
By the way, my name is Joe McLean. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
Hey, I saw some stories last week that I wanted to dive deeper into today. Pope Francis, without liturgical reform, there is no reform of the church. And now we're also seeing a new document out of the Vatican on the validity of the sacraments. There seems to be an uptick on the questioning of the validity of sacraments. In fact, certain baptisms are now not valid because they were said improperly, which means ordinations of people baptized into those are also called into question, which means confessions and in Eucharist and everything else. It seems to be a cascading, compounding problem. And I wonder, can we connect and correlate these things? I don't know. Matt Gaspers is here to join us from Catholic Family News to talk about this very subject. Matt, good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Joe. It's a pleasure.
Traditionis Custodes has been out for a while now. Are we seeing more suppression of the traditional Latin Mass? Are we seeing an uptick, a new wave here?
Well, I think what we have to remember, Pope Francis really tipped his cards when he said in his letter accompanying Traditionis Custodes that was addressed to the bishops, similar how Benedict XVI, when he released Summorum Pontificum, he also released a separate letter addressed specifically to the bishops, giving commentary as to why he released it. Francis did the same thing, and he said at the end of that letter that, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but he said something like, in due time, every Roman Catholic needs to quote-unquote return to the Novus Ordo. So, no, it's not going to end. His agenda is to stamp it out completely over time. In due time are his words.
Is he going to ask the Russian patriarchy in hopes of reuniting the two halves of the church? Are they going to ask the Greeks? Are they going to ask all these Easterns to change their divine liturgy in order to, come together under one? No, we would say that they deserve their tradition. I think we would argue that they have a right to their tradition, a liturgical tradition. But why doesn't the Latin Church have a right to its liturgical tradition?
Well, that is the conundrum. I think there might be, if I remember correctly, there's something going on in regard to liturgical reform in the Syro-Malabar Church, if I recall correctly. That's one kind of offshoot example from the Eastern rites. But overall, Francis does seem to be very friendly and respectful to the Eastern rites, whereas he denigrates the traditional Roman rite. And you quoted it earlier. He said last week to a plenary session of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, so all the members of that dicastery were present in Rome, and he specifically was relating this to the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican II's purpose was to, quote, reform the church in her fundamental dimensions, and that, quote, without liturgical reform, there is no reform of the church. And this, I connect this to what he said in a document, Desiderio Desideravi, which is basically an attempted defense of Traditionis Custodes. He released that in June of 2022. And here's what he said regarding the Novus Ordo versus the traditional Latin Mass. He said, it would be trivial to read the tensions unfortunately present around the celebration as a simple divergence between different tastes concerning a particular form. The problematic is primarily ecclesiological. That's a huge statement. I wrote about this at the time. I said, the tensions which exist between Catholics who embrace the liturgical reform, in other words, the Novus Ordo, and those who resist it, are based not on different tastes, according to Francis, but on divergent ecclesiologies. That is, on fundamentally different doctrinal positions about the church's very nature. That's the object of ecclesiology, is the nature of the church. So that's a huge statement to make. I think it shows why he has such a deep problem with the traditional Latin Mass, because the traditional Latin Mass makes present the traditional ecclesiology of the church, which he and his cohorts like Cardinal Blaise Cupich, Cardinal Arthur Roach clearly reject.
The Fraternity of St. Peter in particular has had a letter. It's basically giving them the opportunity to keep going. I think the canons as well, if I'm not mistaken. So how do you see those communities being affected moving forward?
I think it comes down very much to the Rescript that was released last February in regard to Traditionis Custodes. So this is like a legal clarification concerning Traditionis Custodes. Traditionis Custodes is a universal disciplinary law of the Roman Pontiff for the entire Roman Church. There was a canonical loophole that several bishops, including I think my own local bishop here in the Archdiocese of Denver, invoked to kind of sidestep and allow established traditional Latin masses in parish churches to continue. Cardinal Roach wanted to close that loophole last February, and so they just to be clear, this Canon 87 is the one that I'm talking about. It gives a diocesan bishop, whenever he judges that it contributes to their spiritual good, is able to dispense the faithful from universal and particular disciplinary laws issued for the Church by the supreme authority, in other words, the Pope. But he's not able to dispense if the Holy See reserves something to itself, and that's what this Rescript did last February. It said, these dispensations are reserved in a special way to the Apostolic See, and specifically citing Canon 87, and then it cites for Traditionis Custodes. So these things only the Pope can grant permission, or the Holy See. Number one, the use of a parish church or the erection of a personal parish for the celebration of the Eucharist using the old missal. And that's the crux of the matter, because at least for the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, their parishes, as I understand it, are canonically personal parishes. So they're established, they're erected by a local bishop in a diocese, and they are what's called a personal parish. It's not a territorial parish like most are, but it's for a specific rite, namely the traditional rite. So Rome is essentially saying to bishops, you cannot establish any more personal parishes. Now, I have heard that there have been new priestly fraternity parishes established since Traditionis Custodes. I have not been able to confirm that personally, but I do know of one instance personally of a bishop saying, when it was requested that he bring in the fraternity to establish a new parish, he said, I can't do that because Traditionis Custodes does not allow me to establish personal parishes. And that was just earlier this year. You mentioned the Institute of Christ the King. Their situation might be different because I think their churches are called the oratories, I think is what they call them. So that they might be able to get away with more canonically. I don't know. But I mean, they're going to clamp down on that too eventually, I think.
Wow. Let me bring this document up. This comes out of the Vatican, and it's called On the Validity of the Sacraments by the Doctrine of Faith here. And basically, this is addressing a major concern, people discovering that their baptisms were invalid. And there was at least one priest I can remember who meant his ordination was therefore invalid. And think about the confessions he heard, the Eucharist he confected.
Masses,
all of that was invalid at that point. That's kind of a big deal. What say you, Matt Gaspers?
Oh, it's a huge deal. It's unbelievable scandal and sacrilege and everything else. And I mean, one of the main reasons, if not the main reason why this was even possible, all of these invalid sacraments, is because of the changes of the Second Vatican Council to putting all of the sacraments in the vernacular. When all of the sacraments with a form, meaning the words of the sacraments, were set in stone in Latin, it was impossible to have invalid form. You could still have invalid matter and perhaps an invalid intention, but it was much more difficult. The bar was much higher. It was much more difficult and rare to have an invalid sacrament when you have everything in Latin.
I want to get your take. On a scale of 1 to 10, how serious is that issue, I guess is my question to you.
I suppose it would vary from parish to parish. I mean, you have priests who are more orthodox who are going to, I always forget if it's do the red and say the black, or if it's do the black and say the red. I forget which one.
The same thing. But, I'll mix it up too.
But you're always going to have, even in the mainstream diocesan parishes, there's going to be a gamut of priests who are going to be more faithful to that than others. But I mean, it's probably more of a problem than we'd like to admit.
I saw this article that you had. Anglican Eucharist in Roman Basilica, false ecumenism on display. We don't even recognize the validity of their ordination, let alone their ability to confect the Holy Eucharist. And we allow this, and it gives the perception as though we do, causing great scandal within Holy Mother Church. Prior to the liturgical reform, would we have seen this much actual questioning going on about the validity of sacraments? Matt Gaspers, what say you?
Well, I just want to point out one other irony about the so-called Anglican Eucharist, and those are Vatican News's words. That's their description of that abomination, by the way. That event was held on January 25th, the very same day that this new document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith was approved. So it's very ironic that they're talking about the validity of the sacraments when an invalid fake mass was held in a Roman basilica. But as far as, whether or not we had a lot of problems with invalid sacraments before the council and the reforms, I would have to assume the answer is no, because as I said before the break, it would be much more difficult for that to be a major problem with when you have every priest in the Roman Rite saying the exact same words in Latin every time. It's pretty hard to ad lib in a foreign language that you're not conversant in, or that would take a lot more premeditation, I guess you could say, than doing it in the vernacular. Much easier to do it in the vernacular. But I think also in general, the problem with the liturgical reform is that it really didn't respect what the Council of Trent called the received and approved rites of the church, which are grounded in apostolic tradition. And this new document from the DDF in paragraph 16, the second half of the document, as I read it, is basically an attempt at defending the liturgical reform in the face of these horrible invalid sacraments and abuses and whatnot. So it says, the liturgical reform of the sacraments, which took place according to the principles of the Second Vatican Council, called for the rites to be revised so that they more clearly express the holy realities they signify and produce. That's basically a quote from Sacrosanctum Concilium, Article 50, which was Vatican II's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. But if you think about it, those kinds of statements really contain outrageous implications. First of all, it completely ignores the fact that the Council of Trent, the liturgical commission following the Council of Trent, which was put in place by St. Pius V, to restore the Roman Missal, as Pius V said in Quo Primum, according to the custom and rite of the Holy Fathers. They did their work very well, and yet the Sacrosanctum Concilium is saying, no, they didn't, essentially, because you're saying they need to be simplified and be able to more clearly express the holy things they signify. I'm sorry, that's Article 21 of Sacrosanctum Concilium, not Article 50. So the Vatican II is basically claiming the Tridentine Liturgical Commission didn't do a good job, even though the opposite is demonstrably the case. It's also shocking the implicit claim that the texts and rites of the traditional Mass, the very same that helped form saints and doctors of the Church for centuries, do not clearly express the holy things which they signify.
So is this document coming out of the Vatican questioning the spousal fidelity from the Council of Trent Fathers? It seems like they might be.
And again, the irony is that this document cites the Council of Trent. It's in Article 9, it says, the 7 vital gestures, referring to the sacraments, which the Council of Trent solemnly declared to be divinely instituted, thus constitute a privileged place of encounter with Christ the Lord, who gives his grace. But they're contradicting the Council of Trent because they're not respecting what Trent said is the received and approved rites of Holy Mother Church, which can't just be tossed aside on a whim. And the reason why they're approved by the Church is because they were received from apostolic tradition. This is something else I've written about. Folks can find my article at CatholicFamilyNews.com. It's called, Can the Pope Abolish the Traditional Latin Mass? I encourage them to read that article.
You got stay-at-home moms having to read the Catechism of the Council of Trent. So why are they reading it? Because they feel like they don't have a confidence on knowing whether or not a homily is true or what they're reading in the news is true, and they're trying to sort fact from fiction. and they're having to roll up their sleeves and figure this out. And I say that's part of the scandal, because knuckle draggers like me, guys with opinions, are having to try to sort fact from fiction. Do you see that as part of the scandal in church?
It's a failure of the hierarchy. Basically, it's it makes me think really of the message of Our Lady of Fatima and what some have claimed as the still missing part of the third secret of Fatima, which some very reputable sources say. Just for one example, Cardinal Luigi Chiappi, I think, he was the theologian of the papal household under several successive popes, including Pope John Paul II. Basically says that the apostasy in the church will begin at the top. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but also the official archivist for Fatima for many years, Father Joaquin Alonso, who had many in-person interviews with Sister Lucia over the years and wrote a compendium on the subject, talks about the essence of the third secret is a failure of the hierarchy. It's the failure of them to do their duty.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.